A few months ago, I switched completely to color grading all my YouTube videos in HDR, so I gained quite a bit of experience, and today I'm going to share that with you. I will show you how to color grade and deliver HDR in Davinci Resolve for YouTube, and this is probably going to be the only HDR tutorial you need to watch to get started. Quick, easy to follow, but detailed enough so you can actually do it yourself. I will walk you through everything step by step, including the tools you need, the exact settings, and the workflow you need to grade HDR. You will even see how to export it properly for YouTube so it looks amazing, especially on HDR compatible screens, obviously, but also on SDR ones. Now, I won't go super in-depth into every little thing, and I will use simplified language here to make it easier to understand, because this is all about getting you started so you can create cinematic looking HDR videos right away without any confusion. If you want to dive deeper into understanding HDR, the tools, advanced workflows, troubleshooting certain issues, and creating cinematic looks, all of that is available in my Davinci Resolve course, which is currently available at a 40% Christmas discount from the 19th till the 29th of December 2024. This is the best deal you will see for a long time, so if you've been thinking about leveling up your skills, now's the perfect time to check it out. And if you already got my Davinci Resolve course or the Learn with Pascal package, you will find the new HDR color grading module there from now on for free. Anyway, let's get into it. First off, why would you even color grade in HDR? It's more complicated, and SDR also looks pretty good, right? Let me just say, HDR can completely transform how your videos look, and not just in terms of bright, super saturated videos, because for me, one of the biggest advantages is that HDR lets you show your videos in 10-bit color even after uploading to YouTube, and here's why that matters. When you upload an SDR video to YouTube, even if it's 10-bit, YouTube compresses it down to 8-bit, and that often introduces banding, especially in areas like blue skies, clouds, or other smooth transitions, and it just looks bad. Let me give you an example. In my recent video, I stopped having fun filmmaking, let's fix it. I filmed entirely in the mountains, so there were a lot of foggy shots. And if I had that in SDR, I'm 100% sure the fog would have shown visible banding because of the 8-bit limitation, because I had that many times before with all of the SDR videos that I uploaded. Another reason is dynamic range, but it's not like most people think about making the whole image bright and saturated, as mentioned before. It's a common misconception because you often see that on phones, like videos that are shot in HDR on phones. Instead, HDR is about extending the brightest parts of your image, your highlights, without touching the midtones and shadows. So for example, when you look at a properly color graded HDR videos, the shadows and midtones should feel pretty much the same as in an SDR video, but what's different is the way the highlights come alive, like the sun, bright reflections, or glowing lights, because HDR reserves more brightness for them above the SDR range, so they can go further without clipping, creating a much more dynamic and realistic look, so essentially more highlight detail. It also makes it possible to have more saturation in the highlights, so if there is a red light in your shot, for example, that will look better in SDR, because SDR could simply not render such bright and saturated reds, because the color space just doesn't allow it, and this makes it possible for HDR to feel subtle yet powerful. Like if you've ever noticed that some HDR videos look unnatural or overly bright, it's usually because they are not graded properly. So when done right, HDR should actually enhance your footage while keeping it either natural, filmic, or cinematic, however you want. So it's the perfect way to make your videos stand out and look professional. It just gives you more flexibility. Yeah, I know this part takes a bit long, but no worries, I'm ready soon. There's one more thing we have to get into. That's that ultimately HDR can also achieve more consistency between different screens. For example, when I watched my SDR videos on YouTube on my Android TV after color grading them on my Apple devices here, they always look pretty bad on the TV, but very good across all of my other devices. And I've noticed that when I color grade HDR, it looks a lot better on my Android TV, but also on my Apple devices. So it's definitely getting worth into from my experience. So let me show you how to do it. Before we jump into Davinci Resolve, let's talk about your overall setup, because to color grade properly in HDR, you need a display that supports at least 1000 nits of sustained brightness. If you're using a new M-chip MacBook Pro or iPad Pro with a liquid Retina XDR display, you're good to go. Some people say you need more professional screens for HDR, but from my experience, these screens are good enough for creating HDR content for YouTube and other social media platforms at least. And if you're on Windows, I have actually no idea really, because you have to buy some special monitors there and somehow set them up. It looks quite complicated. So just buy a Mac, it's better. You might hate me for that now, but if you follow this advice as a video creator and not a gamer or so, you might thank me later, because Mac is just better for that, trust me. Anyway, even on Apple devices, you have to change a few settings to get started. On a MacBook, you will want to switch to the HDR video P3 ST2084 profile. To do so, just open the menu in the top right corner, click the arrow behind display, and with another click, you will find the HDR video profile there. Later, after color grading, you can switch it back to the normal Apple Display P3 profile. On an iPad, go into the advanced settings under display and brightness. You find them at the very bottom, and there you have to enable reference mode. That's it. Now you will likely notice that your screen looks darker as before. That is correct, because now it uses a fixed brightness so that you can color grade accurately. And to do so, you have to be in a dimmed room, which should be very dark, but not completely dark, like not black. And I do that by simply using one of my video lights set to 5600 Kelvin color temperature and the brightness set to only 1%. If your light is a bit smaller or weaker, maybe set it to 2 or 3%, but you want your room to be quite dark. And you should also make sure that the light points away from your face and not straight into your eyes, because otherwise you might color grade too bright. And overall, setting your studio up like that and doing those settings is important, because if you don't do that, your color grade will look very bad later, way too bright. Alright, let's finally jump into Davinci Resolve. The first thing you need to do is to enable Resolve's color management. Open project settings and under color management, turn on Davinci YRGB color manage for that. Then set the color processing mode to Davinci White Gamut Intermediate, and for the output color space, select Rec 2020 ST2084 1000 nits. That's the HDR PQ standard for most content, including YouTube. Important, stay away from everything that says HLG here. It sounds better when you read about it, but it's actually bad. I experimented a lot with it and it was a waste of time. And also make sure you check the box for HDR mastering is for 1000 nits, and also enable HDR Plus a bit further down below. HDR10 Plus is metadata that ensures your video looks correct on different HDR screens by adjusting the brightness dynamically. Without this, your video might look off on some devices, so that definitely has to be turned on. And next, let's set up the waveform monitor. For that, you simply go to the color page and open the waveform on the bottom right, click the 3 dots above it and set the scale to HDR ST2084 HLG. This will show your brightness levels on a nit scale instead of the usual percentages that you're used to from color grading SDR videos. I also recommend going into the scopes menu and activate show reference levels and set one of those to 203, because that adds a white reference line at 203 nits brightness in your waveform monitor, which is where your diffuse white point should be for the type of HDR we're using here, which is HDR PQ, by the way. That might sound confusing, but it's actually quite easy to understand. Diffuse white essentially means everything that's total white, like bright white clothes, white text, etc. Then SDR that usually sits at 100 nits together with things like the sun or so, which would usually be brighter than clouds or text. And guess what? In HDR they are actually brighter. And this white line that you just set to 203 nits marks the spot where highlights turn into those spectral highlights. So things like text, bright white paper, etc. should sit around the 203 nits line when you color grade, and everything brighter than that, like light bulbs, the sun, bright clouds, and strong reflections, should be above this line. And everything darker than that, like skin, plants, etc., all your midtones and shadows, should stay below this line. This keeps your footage looking balanced and professional, and by color grading this way, you also avoid this overly bright and saturated look that we're so used to getting from HDR footage. Of course, you can sometimes break this rule. Nothing is set in stone in videography. There are sometimes cases where, for example, super bright skin that's directly hit by the sun might be above this line, but generally you should stick to this rule. Let me also show you a few examples here. So if we look at this shot, for example, you notice that nothing goes beyond this line because there are no bright highlights, and therefore even SDR would have enough dynamic range to show this shot. And that's where I'm not making use of the extended highlights range of HDR, because that would simply look bad. On the other hand, if you're looking at this shot here, you notice that only the reflection on the water lives above the 203 nits line and all the rest stays below. And in this shot here, only the white jacket of our guide is somewhat on the 203 nits line, slightly above it, because the sun was quite harsh and I wanted the color grade to reflect that. But that's a good example for diffuse white. And in this night shot here, you can see that only the headlamps cross the 203 nits line, while most of it doesn't even reach 10 nits brightness. And the jackets the light falls on, which are midtones, are somewhere between 10 and 203 nits. So you see, HDR mustn't be everything super bright and overly saturated. You can use it to make rather cinematic and filmic looks better by giving the highlights a bit more room. And that is also my approach to HDR. I don't want these crazy HDR looks that we are so used to. I want to use the capabilities of HDR to make what I already would do in SDR better. That leads us to grading HDR, which I basically explained already, like use this 203 nits line to be sure everything is correct. So if you skipped to here with the YouTube chapters or so, go 1 to 2 minutes back and watch, because there I explain it. And when it comes to grading, I recommend using the HDR color wheels in Resolve a lot, because these let you adjust the blacks, dark areas, shadows, lights, highlights, and specular highlights separately. So these tools give you more control, and I also like how the global slider behaves to change exposure, because it feels a bit more like done in camera. And also about grading, there's one more thing you should be aware of even before you go on your computer, and that is that you would always have to shoot in log if you shoot this process on your camera. Like if you're on Sony, shoot S-Log3, Fujifilm, F-Log2, Canon, C-Log2 or 3 depending on the camera. But you always want to shoot in log profiles, because those give you the highest dynamic range of your camera and also 10-bit, and both are necessities to color grade HDR. So do that in camera, and then in Davinci Resolve, you can simply use the Resolve color management by clicking right on the files, either on the color page or already in your media browser or in the editing page, and selecting input color space. And there you can simply select the log profile that you shot in. And then Davinci Resolve handles all the colors for you, because Davinci Resolve puts all the colors coming from your camera into a super large color space, which is larger than HDR. And then it essentially, after your color grade, compresses it down into HDR, which means that you work non-destructively, like you don't break any colors or so with the adjustments that you do there, at least if your original footage is already strong enough. That's again why you should shoot log and 10-bit. And yeah, this makes it super easy. That's also why I told you in the beginning to turn color management on. Of course, it's not all good though. A problem with grading HDR footage can be plugins. If you're using color grading plugins, make sure they support HDR, because many are only made for SDR. Same goes for LUTs. You need HDR or Davinci Wide Gamut compatible LUTs to color grade HDR footage. Otherwise, it might turn out bad. Plugins that work with HDR and Davinci Resolve are Dehancer and the one that I use, Look Designer by Color Lab, which lets you create your own film look and integrates perfectly into Davinci Wide Gamut. You will find a link to this plugin in the description below. It's great for creating cinematic looks quickly and works in HDR in the Davinci Resolve color managed workflow by setting both the input and output profiles to Davinci Wide Gamut, so it makes getting your film look in HDR actually very easy. But if you're not ready to invest that much in such a plugin yet, you can achieve similar results using my Devscape LUTs, which are HDR compatible if you use the RCM version of those LUTs, again with Davinci Resolve color management, because they are made for the Davinci Wide Gamut, which is a super large color space that I have been talking about. You will also find a link to them in the description, and don't forget, they are also part of the 40% Christmas discount, so now is the best time to grab them. So color grading essentially stays the same, but next up is exporting. Once your grade is done, it's time to export so that YouTube also identifies it as HDR. For that, you have to stay on the color page first, go into the color menu on top, and under HDR10+, click Analyze All. This step generates metadata needed for HDR playback on different devices, as not all of them feature the same brightness. So with that, they know how to adjust the brightness dynamically. And then you go to the delivery page, select either HDR H.265 or ProRes 42, important, not H.264, and there make sure embed HDR10 metadata is checked. I also recommend setting the encoding profile to main 4210 for 10-bit export. This ensures best quality but is optional. And that's basically it. Your HDR video is now ready to upload to YouTube. Keep in mind that HDR processing on YouTube can take a while, like sometimes it takes up to 48 hours, but the SDR version of your video will be available pretty fast. And to check when the HDR version is ready, just watch the video, click on the settings icon, and when you see HDR next to the resolution in the playback settings, you know it's there. So by now you should have a basic understanding of how to color grade HDR, but like I said earlier, this is just a starting point. If you want to dive deeper into HDR workflows, know how to handle footage that's not supported by Davinci's color management, and learn my whole editing and color grading process to create truly cinematic videos, check out my full course on Davinci Resolve, and don't forget about the 40% Christmas discount until the 29th of December. This is the most affordable it will ever be for a long time, so don't miss this out. The link is in the description. And also, if you're new to video editing or looking to refine your skills, I also have a video that might interest you. It's a complete guide that covers everything you need to know to get started. Click here in the corner to watch that now, and I will see you over there.